What is happening, everybody? It's another NBA strategy show here where we are going to break down game 2 of the Dallas Mavericks and Minnesota Timberwolves series, looking at it from both a DraftKings and a FanDuel showdown / single game perspective. As you guys are watching this video, like, follow, subscribe, all that good stuff over on YouTube helps us out a whole bunch. And it's only going to take a second of your time. Totally free for you as well. And also, free giveaway. We've got a winner from yesterday's giveaway, which was which player would score the least amount of fantasy points of all the starters in yesterday's game. And the winner, it is Ryan Cox, 1099. He went with Aaron Nesmith. Most of the people in the comment section either guessed Nesmith or Nembhard. Ended up being Nesmith, but he barely had less fantasy points than Miles Turner. There was actually a scenario where if Turner was the lowest score, I don't think anybody in the chat would have ended up winning. So shout out to Ryan Cox, 1099. Shoot me a DM on Twitter so I could shoot you over a link and a promo code to get you free access for an Odd Chopper subscription. We'll do another giveaway for today. If you guys remember the other day, what we did was which player would score the most amount of fantasy points, but it couldn't be Luka Doncic and it couldn't have been Anthony Edwards. It had to be somebody else in the game. It ended up being Kyrie Irving. So let's bring Luka into the mix. And here's going to be the question for today. How many DraftKings fantasy points does Luka score? Let me know below in the comments, and it's going to be like a closest to the pin competition. Obviously, if somebody gets the answer right, you win, but you don't have to actually get the answer right to the decimal points. Which person is going to be closest to Luka's DraftKings fantasy point score? And the winner of that, you're going to get yourself a free Odd Chopper subscription. So comment below. How many fantasy points does Luka score today using DraftKings scoring? But let's start breaking down the slate here. I've already got my top DraftKings lineups built out, simmed, and favored. If you guys want to sign up for any of the tools we have at Stochastic, links below in the comments section. But if we go ahead and look at the number one overall projected lineup by SimROI, there are actually two lineups here that are projecting a little bit better than the other ones here. And the top one here, this is Kyrie Irving in the multiplier spot with Derek Lively Jr., Derek Jones Jr., Karl-Anthony Towns, Mike Conley, and Rudy Gobert. And then the second best projected lineup here by SimROI, it's Daniel Gafford in the captain spot with Jaden McDaniels, Cat, Kyrie Irving, Luka Doncic, Nickeil Alexander-Walker. So it is notable. Top overall lineup here by projected SimROI doesn't have Luka in it. And one thing that we have seen is in a lot of these showdown slates in recent days, it actually hasn't had the best overall fantasy producer in the winning lineup. I mean, we've seen now in both game 1 and game 2 of the Celtics-Pacer series, in neither of them was Jason Tatum in the optimal lineup. So we'll see if that ends up being the case for today's slate as far as Luka goes. And we'll see what the exposures are looking like to Luka in a second. But first, let's look at dupes. Which lineups are expected to be duped most heavy? And yeah, as per usual, no surprise, none of them are in our top 150 SimROI lineups. One thing that is a little bit surprising to me here, the number one most duped lineup actually doesn't have Luka in the captain spot. It has Rudy Gobert in the captain spot. Gobert was crazy popular in game 1 of the series. I'm looking ahead to see, is he going to end up being that popular again? We'll see our ownership projections in a second. Initial thoughts, it seems probably because he is in the highest projected or most duped lineup here. It is Rudy Gobert in the captain spot, Anthony Edwards, Derek Lively, Kyle Anderson, Luka Doncic, Naz Reid. Yeah, I can see how this is popular. This is a very points-chasey lineup, and it does have Rudy Gobert in the captain spot, so maybe that aspect of it is a little bit less so, but you got Derek Lively, who had a big game in game 1. You've got Kyle Anderson, who had a big game in game 1, and Naz Reid. And then, of course, Luka and Edwards in it. So it's just kind of Gobert fitting into the picture. I actually think this lineup has less to do with Gobert and more to do with he's just the one who fits with all of the other guys that had big fantasy games in game 1. So, yeah, I can see how this lineup is as popular as it is. So lots of dupes to this lineup. It looks like it's one that a big chunk of the field is going to be playing. Probably one that you're going to see like 300-400 times duped in the large field tournaments. Let's look at the exposures. Which players are we getting to the most? Starting in the captain spot. And yeah, actually getting to a good amount of Luka here. So this has not been the case for me with some of the pay-up options in these games so far. But what's different about today, Luka's actually projected for sub 20% ownership right now. So maybe he comes more popular later on in the day. But maybe this is a situation, too, where the field is seeing like, hey, some of these high-priced options haven't been crushing it in showdown. And then as a result, people are building slightly more balanced lineups. But yeah, if the field is not going to be playing Luka at like the the crazy high ownership that he was expected to have last game or what Jason Tatum has had the other couple of games, then actually does make sense to go the other direction and play more of Luka when the field is building different lineups. So looks like for me, it could end up being a Luka night tonight. In lineups that don't have Luka in the captain spot, makes a whole lot of sense to get to Kyrie Irving. If you guys remember the video, what was it? Wednesday was game one of this series. And for game one, we did have Luka projected to be very, very popular. And one of the reasons the Sims was giving me a lot of exposure to Kyrie Irving in that captain spot was because he was just the most sensible leverage play off of Luka Doncic. If the field was all going to be going to Luka and he had low ownership on Kyrie, well, it made sense to play Kyrie instead, because in a scenario where Luka doesn't have a big game, it probably means that Kyrie Irving had more usage, had the ball in his hands more, had a higher assist rate. So even for today, Kyrie had a pretty big game one, only projected for 6% ownership in the captain spot. He does look like the best overall contrarian guy to be rostering at the captain, just 6% ownership there. Cat, about even with the field on him. I'm a little bit underweight to the field on Anthony Edwards, a little bit underweight on Rudy Gobert as well. Gobert 14% owned in the captain spot, Anthony Edwards 20%, Cat 10%. So yeah, I got a pretty big overweight stand to Kyrie, coming in a little bit overweight to Luka as well in the multiplier spot. But nothing else really standing out all that much relative to ownership. I was about in line with the field on Karl-Anthony Towns. So yeah, takeaways here. Looks like Luka, perfectly good pay up option in the captain spot. We just have to find the salary saving plays that we're going to look for in the flex spot in a second to get up to him. And if you want to be contrarian, Kyrie Irving, the guy to go to. Flex options, overall players I'm getting to the most in the flex, starting with Derrick Jones Jr. in nearly half of my lineups. And he is looking like a little bit of a contrarian play that we could save some salary with, only 26.6% projected ownership going to Derrick Jones Jr. And then we've also got Luka showing up in a good amount of lineups here, Kyrie Irving as well. So yeah, my lineups do look like they're geared more towards the Dallas side of the game than the Minnesota side of the game, considering that Luka and Kyrie are two of my three most rostered flex plays, and were also my two most popular captains. Getting to more of Derek Lively than Daniel Gafford, which I do prefer, and it's very close, right? I mean, we've got 39% Gafford here, 41% Lively, but if I'm hand building one lineup, I would be going to Derek Lively over Daniel Gafford, particularly if their ownership is going to be about the same, which is the expectation as of right now. Derek Lively just been the guy who's playing bigger minutes as of late and is closing games over Daniel Gafford. One thing I am interested to see, though, what happens if Dallas is losing? Because in game one of the series, I did have a thought where it's like, all right, if they're down 10 points in the fourth quarter to Minnesota, do they go with Gafford or Lively in the closing lineup, or do they go to a Josh Green, or do they go to a Tim Hardaway Jr. potentially to try to get spacing on the court and get more three-point shooting to try to get back into a game where they're losing? And we do have a game two where even though Dallas won game one, Minnesota's 5-point favorites. I think the most likely game script is for Dallas to be trailing. So there is a part of me that's curious, like, can we see a Josh Green or a Tim Hardaway Jr., maybe even, but probably not Hardy just because it would be too small of a lineup with Luka, Kyrie, and Hardy all on the court at the same time. But I think Josh Green or Tim Hardaway Jr. are live to close this game. It's something to keep in mind when building some tournament lineups. We saw this in the regular season, and this is maybe not the best indicator because the last time in the regular season, the Timberwolves and the Mavericks played a really close competitive game. It was before the Daniel Gafford and PJ Washington trades, but it is notable to me that in a game where Dallas needed to get shooting on the court, they did close with Tim Hardaway Jr. So something, food for thought if you want to build a lineup that creates a game script where maybe Dallas is trailing in the later stages of the fourth quarter. But yeah, as far as the rotations went in game one, we ended up getting, let's see, pulling this up here. Yeah, we ended up getting 26.5 minutes out of Lively, 13.5 out of Green, 10.5 out of Tim Hardaway Jr., and then 9 out of Hardy. So we didn't really see the minutes there, which makes it hard to project, but I'm interested to see what that game script could potentially look like. Other players that we're getting to a good amount of in the flex spot here, Nickeil Alexander-Walker. One thing that stands out about Nickeil Alexander-Walker is just that he's lower owned. One thing about the last game, game one of the series, that I did not like about Nickeil Alexander-Walker was that he was projected for nearly 40% ownership. I didn't like him at 40% ownership. I think he's worth getting shares of when he's only projected for 20% ownership. And then also, he's a little bit cheaper. He allows us to get up to guys like Luka in some lineups. Kyle Anderson, he played a surprisingly big role in game one of the series. That was not something I foresaw happening. We ended up getting 17 minutes off the bench for Kyle Anderson, and he played pretty well in those minutes too. So if we're going to be getting like 16 to 18 minutes out of Kyle Anderson, It's good enough to project him for 13 fantasy points. That gets him into a third of my lineups. The one issue with Kyle Anderson, though, is he's expected to be very popular, 41% of the field playing him. So while he looks like a good value play, I am a little bit underweight to the field to him just because of how popular he is. But let's look at all the leverage options here and who am I most underweight to the field to. And biggest underweight stands for me, Naz Reid, Anthony Edwards, and Karl Anthony Towns. The biggest issue with Naz Reid, he's just become crazy popular. I think he was 52% owned in game one of the series. So kind of what I said about Kyle Anderson before, there's an upside for Naz Reid relative to his price tag. And I do think, like, if you guys are playing cash games, he's a great option to go to from there, but just a little bit too popular. And also Naz Reid, if Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns stay out of foul trouble, which I know is a pretty big if for Karl Anthony Towns, then just get a guy in Naz Reid who only plays about 20 minutes. And in that scenario, it's hard for him to really make his way into an optimal lineup in 20 minutes at what his current price tag is. So 44% projected ownership for Naz Reid. I do like being underweight to the field on him. And then also, like we said here, a little bit underweight to Anthony Edwards and Cat. Who are we overweight to? Overweight to Derrick Jones Jr., Kyrie Irving, Nickeil Alexander-Walker. One other thought about NAW here, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, is I do think he's a pretty good pivot off of Kyle Anderson for most of the playoffs. Nickeil Alexander-Walker has been ahead of Kyle Anderson in the rotation, and one of the reasons that Kyle Anderson did play some of those bigger minutes last game was because he played well. There's a definite scenario where Kyle Anderson doesn't play as well this game. Nickeil Alexander-Walker knocks down some of his threes, which he hasn't been doing as of late. I forget exactly what the number is, but Nickeil Alexander-Walker hasn't made a three in like a couple of weeks or something. He's been on a massive just dry spell shooting. And yeah, he went 0 for 4 from 3 in game one. I just looked at the stats really quickly there. So if Nickeil Alexander knocks down his shots, then maybe Kyle Anderson plays 12 minutes and you get 20 out of NAW. So you can see where there's some leverage on him as opposed to playing Kyle Anderson. And then overweight to Kyrie Irving, Derrick Jones Jr. A little bit of exposure to Josh Green as well. Have been 15% of lineups. Like I mentioned before, I think there's a chance that Josh Green closes this game if the Mavericks are trailing late. That makes him somebody to get exposure to, especially of really low ownership. 6.8% projected ownership. He's a reasonable way to differentiate a lineup. So that's a walkthrough of everything we have on DraftKings. Let's go ahead and look at some FanDuel lineups now. And if you guys haven't done it yet, like, follow, subscribe. Really helps us out here in the YouTube algorithm. So I appreciate it a whole bunch if you guys could take a half second to do that. And in the meantime, let's simulate out the FanDuel slate. I selected 30% to first. Oh, that was just kind of force of habit because that's what the recent FanDuel slates have been paying out. To first. Did I make a mistake here? Is it not 30% to first? Let me check. Okay. Tonight's slate. The app not working? Well, if the app isn't working, it's a whole nother issue. FanDuel is absolute dog shit app. I like it for the sportsbook. The DFS app, though. Okay, what's happening here? Here we go. Now it's working. It was frozen for a second. No, it's not. I'm trying to select the tournaments, and it says contests unavailable. Okay, so I'm just going to assume this is 30% to first. FanDuel app isn't working at the time I'm recording this, so I can't see what the contests look like. I'm assuming it's the $150,000 prize pool, $50K to first. So I selected the 30% to first payout there. All right, so let's select the top 150 lineups here. And we do have one lineup here with a pretty high sim ROI, 235.3. That's not expected to be duped. Anthony Edwards in the MVP spot with Karl Anthony Towns, PJ Washington, Jaden McDaniels, Derek Lively. And by the way, not expected to be duped just means in the pool of lineups that I built out in the contest generator, this one didn't end up being duped. It doesn't actually mean that it'll have 0 dupes, but at the very least, it means that it's going to be a lightly duped lineup and helps us find some of the more unique lineups using the contest generator and the sims here. But what are expected to be the very heavily duped lineups on FanDuel, and holy shit, there are some crazy duped ones. So, I mean, we're looking at these top couple of lineups are going to be played so many times by the field, and no real surprise, but almost all the heavy dupe lineups have Luka in the MVP spot. There's a couple of Ant Edwards lineups here. But same sort of rant I went on a couple of days ago with Luka. If you're playing on FanDuel and you're playing Luka in the MVP spot and you're not leaving salary on the table, you're playing a lineup that probably a few hundred other people are playing. So try not to do that in your FanDuel lineup. You'll see this one here was duped 280 times out of the 5,000 lineups I've built. So we could expect in the larger field tournaments that have more than 5,000 entries, this lineup's probably going to be played like 600 times. Luka, Kyrie, Gobert, Gafford, Derek Jones Jr. This one is well expected to be really heavily duped. Luka, Edwards, Gobert, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Derek Jones Jr. You don't want to play these lineups. If you played 150 lineups and played these lineups, even if it came in first place, you're losing money for the slate because of how often these lineups are expected to be duped. But let's go to our exposures now and see what it is that we're getting to in that MVP spot. And yeah, Luka's super, super popular at the MVP over on FanDuel. That's no surprise at all. He's clearly the player that's expected to score the most fantasy points. It's just hard to build unique lineups with him. So he's my most rostered MVP, but a little bit underweight to the field. If you are playing Luka, either leave salary on the table, reasonable way to differentiate a lineup, or get a little bit different in the star or pro spots. That's how you'd want to approach a Luka MVP lineup. If you want to get off of him in the MVP spot, Anthony Edwards is the most sensible pivot to be getting to, or it could also go to Kyrie Irving and just hope Kyrie has a massive Kyrie game, which in the first half of last game, it did look like he was going to end up outscoring Luka from a fantasy standpoint. Didn't ultimately end up being the case, but there is a non-zero chance that Kyrie Irving could outscore Luka. And it honestly happens much more than the ownership suggests, because we've got Kyrie at 3.7% ownership and then Luka at 70.3. So let's see. So he is, so if this game plays 20 times and Kyrie outscores Luka from a fantasy point standpoint 1 out of 20 times, if you think Kyrie has that in him, outscore Luka 5% of the time, 1 out of 20 times, then he's under-owned relative to Luka in the MVP spot. That's all you need for this to be a plus ROI. Pivot is going to Kyrie Irving, and he outscores Luka 1 out of 20 times. Let's look at the pro and star spots now. And in the star spot, the player we're getting the most of is Rudy Gobert at 15% projected ownership. Have him in 23% of lineups. About even with the field on Kyrie Irving, even with Cat, a little bit underweight to the field on Edwards here. But Rudy Gobert looking like the best play in the star spot, according to our sims here. And then in the pro spot, well, Gobert is crazy popular in the pro spot. So that's one of the reasons it also makes sense to play Gobert in the star spot is if Gobert goes out and has a really big game, sure, a lot of people have played him in the pro spot, but that's actually going to hurt their lineups a little bit, because if he is somebody who scores so many points that you need him in the star spot, well, then he looks really good there. So Gobert looks like a good star play, looks a little bit overowned, actually a good amount overowned in the pro spot. And then also PJ Washington, Kyrie Irving, a couple of other ways you could get different in the pro spot is going to PJ Washington or go to Kyrie in the pro spot as opposed to the star spot. In the flex over on FanDuel, players we're getting the most of, Derek Lively here is showing up in a bunch of lineups, and looks like a pretty good way to get leverage off of Daniel Gafford. Gafford being cheaper over on FanDuel is projected for double the ownership of Derek Lively. So if you get one of these big Derek Lively games where he closes and scores a good amount more fantasy points than Daniel Gafford, you got yourself some good leverage there. We were overweight to the field on Derek Jones Jr. on DraftKings, but on FanDuel, where he's crazy popular, we come in underweight to the field on him. Other players we're overweight to in the flex here, Mike Conley and PJ Washington also showing up in 26 and 19% of lineups. If we look at leverage overall, underweight to Derek Jones Jr., Daniel Gafford, Nickeil Alexander-Walker on FanDuel. And this is where you really see how it differs playing on different sites, because on DraftKings, we had pretty good overweight stands on both Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Derek Jones Jr., but coming in underweight to them on FanDuel. And players were overweight to in the flex. Overweight to PJ Washington, overweight to Jaden McDaniels, Derek Lively, and then Rudy Gobert as well. Lively's the one that interests me the most of all these options, just because of that leverage we're getting off of Gafford that I'd mentioned before. So that is going to be a roundup of today's slates for both FanDuel and DraftKings. If you guys haven't done it yet, like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment below. How many fantasy points does Luka score tonight using DraftKings scoring? Whoever is closest or gets the correct answer, you're going to get a free OddsShopper subscription. So guys, thank you very much for watching. Later tonight, live before lock, I'll be on with Eric Lindquist, and I'm doing the post-lock show on Playback with Ben Raza. We'll sweat out the game. We'll look for some additional bets, so go check us out there as well. Good luck today, guys, and see you later.